The bride wrote her vows and her obituary just hours before saying, "I do." Welcome to Marple Casebook. I am your host, Selwyn. Be part of the mystery. Comment below and share where you're watching from today. I always look forward to reading your stories. Let's begin. It was a most peculiar affair, the sort that sent shivers of excitement through the hushed drawing rooms of St. Mary Mead. The letter arrived on a damp Wednesday morning, delivered with the usual bundle of correspondence at the vicarage. It was written in an elegant yet trembling hand, addressed to the local paper, and bore an ominous title, "The Death of Annabel Hastings." The editor of the chipping Cleghorn Gazette nearly dismissed it as an unfortunate mistake, a premature obituary sent in error, but as he skimmed the contents, the blood drained from his face. The letter described in chilling detail the final moments of one Annabel Hastings, her own death, written in the first person. "By the time this letter reaches you, I shall be dead, murdered in my own home on the eve of my wedding. The hand that ends my life is one I have trusted. Do not be fooled by appearances. Truth is a master of disguise." At first, it seemed like some ghastly prank, but when the editor sent a clerk to confirm the whereabouts of Miss Hastings, the horror of the situation became clear. Annabel Hastings had indeed been found dead that very morning, lying cold in the grand bedroom of Marchwood Hall, the manor she was to share with her new husband, Mr. Gerald Fenwick. The police were baffled. The room had been locked from the inside, the windows bolted. There were no signs of forced entry, no struggle, no obvious weapon. The doctor who examined the body could find no wound, no strangulation marks, no indication of poison, only a faint perfume of almonds in the air. It was as if death had crept upon her in the most unnatural way. The impending nuptials had been the talk of the county. Annabel Hastings was a woman of means, recently returned from abroad, where she had inherited a considerable fortune. She was to marry Gerald Fenwick, a charming but financially troubled gentleman of good lineage. Their courtship had been brief but passionate, and many had whispered of a whirlwind romance that might not withstand the weight of practical concerns. Speculation ran wild. Was it a lover from her past, a spurned suitor, or something more insidious, an enemy hidden in plain sight? The letter's cryptic warning only deepened the mystery. Who was the trusted hand that had betrayed her? The case might have remained an enigma, if not for the presence of an elderly lady with sharp blue eyes and an unassuming manner. Miss Jane Marple had been staying at the vicarage, enjoying the countryside and the occasional intrigue that country life afforded. When she heard of the letter and the impossible crime, her knitting needle stilled, and she said, with a certain quiet certainty, "It's always so. Very simple, you know. One only needs to ask the right questions." The police naturally dismissed her at first, but Miss Marple had a way of seeing past the obvious, of noticing the small inconsistencies that others overlooked. And as she began to ask her questions, the tangled threads of deceit, love, and murder began to unravel. Miss Marple arrived at Marchwood Hall that afternoon, her delicate frame wrapped in a tweed coat, a neat hat pinned precisely atop her silvery curls. To an untrained eye, she appeared as nothing more than an elderly spinster with a fondness for gossip and gardening. But those who knew her well understood that behind her mild gaze lay a mind as sharp as a needle, capable of unraveling the most perplexing of mysteries with nothing more than quiet observation. The grand house stood solemn against the grey sky, its ivy-covered facade whispering secrets of old wealth and quiet discontent. The constable at the door hesitated when she introduced herself, but after a brief exchange with the inspector, she was allowed entry, if only on the vicar's insistence that she was a harmless old dear who took an interest in such things. Inside, the house bore the hush of recent tragedy. A maid, pale-faced and red-eyed, lingered at the edge of the grand foyer, whispering to another servant. The air carried the faint scent of something floral, perhaps lavender or lilies, mingling with the cold, stale stillness that seemed to grip the place. Miss Marple listened as the inspector, a stout and no-nonsense man named Forsyth, summarized the case for her benefit. The body of Miss Hastings had been discovered that morning by her lady's maid, Lydia Prentice, who had gone to wake her mistress and found the door locked. Upon forcing entry, they found Annabel Hastings lying motionless on her wedding bed, eyes wide open, hands resting atop the lace coverlet. No struggle, no obvious cause of death, just that eerie stillness, and the letter that had arrived mere hours before the discovery. The authorities had considered poison, given the faint scent of almonds, but an initial examination revealed no traces in her system. There was talk of some rare, undetectable toxin, but nothing conclusive. The room itself had been left untouched, save for the forced lock. A classic locked room mystery, impossible yet undeniable. Miss Marple, however, did not dwell on what seemed impossible. Instead, she watched. As Forsyth spoke, she noted the young maid Lydia, who stood trembling in the doorway, wringing her hands, eyes darting toward the staircase as if expecting something, or someone. The butler, Mr. Pettigrew, maintained a stony composure, his gloved hands folded before him, yet his right thumb rubbed absent-mindedly against his palm, a nervous tic, perhaps. And then there was Gerald Fenwick, the bereaved fiancé, standing apart from the others, his gaze distant, his mouth set in a grim line of sorrow. "She was well loved, I assume?" Miss Marple inquired gently, her voice carrying a note of sympathy. Fenwick exhaled sharply. "She was remarkable," he said, though there was something hollow in his tone. "Brilliant, kind, always full of life. I cannot imagine who would wish her harm." Miss Marple studied him a moment before turning her attention to the room where Annabel Hastings had met her end. The grand bedroom was untouched, save for the disruption caused by the investigation. A lace wedding gown lay draped over a chair by the vanity, its intricate beading glistening in the soft light filtering through the tall windows. The scent of lilies was stronger here, perhaps from the bouquet on the bedside table, its white petals beginning to wilt. Miss Marple moved carefully, her eyes sweeping over the details. The mirror on the vanity was slightly smudged, as if someone had touched it hastily. A silver hairbrush lay at an angle, a single dark strand of hair caught in its bristles. Strange, considering Annabel Hastings was fair-haired. The bedside drawer was slightly ajar, revealing a small velvet pouch containing a delicate gold locket. Inside was a miniature portrait of a man, not Gerald Fenwick, but another, with dark hair and a stern expression. She turned back toward the others. "I imagine Miss Hastings received many visitors before her wedding," she said, her voice light. Fenwick hesitated. "A few, mostly friends, family, and old acquaintances, perhaps." There was a flicker of something quickly masked, before he nodded. "Yes, a man from her past did visit, briefly. An old suitor, but it was nothing. She assured me she had no lingering attachments." Miss Marple only smiled. "How very modern of her," she murmured. Her fingers brushed against the vanity's surface as she passed, noting the fine layer of powder disturbed in a peculiar way, as if something had been wiped clean. She made no comment, but tucked the observation away. The inspector cleared his throat. Mrs. Hastings's letter suggested she knew her life was in danger, but if she suspected someone close to her, why not seek help? Miss Marple's gaze drifted back to the lace wedding gown. "Perhaps she did," she mused. "Perhaps she simply ran out of time." As she turned toward the door, her gaze caught on something else. A pair of embroidered slippers set neatly by the bedside. They were perfectly positioned, almost too neatly. And yet, beneath the lace hem of the coverlet, she saw the barest glimpse of something else. A second pair of shoes, peeking just slightly from under the bed. Miss Marple's expression remained calm, but in her mind, The pieces of the puzzle had already begun shifting into place. Miss Marple did not immediately draw attention to the second pair of shoes. Instead, she stepped back from the bed, hands clasped lightly before her, and turned to Inspector Forsyth. Perhaps it would be useful to speak with those closest to Missy Hastings. After all, nothing happens in isolation. The inspector grunted his agreement and summoned the gathered household into the drawing room. It was a grand space, though the heavy drapes and dark mahogany furniture lent it a somber air. The group assembled cautiously: Gerald Fenwick, his posture stiff with grief; Lydia Prentice, her hands still trembling; Mr. Pettigrew, his expression carefully blank; and Mrs. Connolly, the housekeeper, a stout woman with shrewd eyes and an air of quiet efficiency. Miss Marple settled herself in a high-backed chair, her knitting in hand, though her fingers barely moved. She knew from experience that when people felt observed, they became guarded. But when they believed they were simply being listened to, that was when the truth began to slip through. The inspector turned first to Gerald Fenwick. "You were the last person to see Miss Hastings alive?" Fenwick nodded, his jaw tightening. "We dined together in the study around 9 o'clock. She was nervous, understandably so, given the wedding tomorrow. We talked for a while, and then she retired to her room. That was the last time I saw her." Miss Marple watched him carefully. There was truth in his words, but also a certain carefulness, as if he were treading upon thin ice. Inspector Forsyth made a note. "And you remained downstairs?" "Yes. I had a whiskey in the library. Mr. Pettigrew can confirm that. He brought it to me." The butler inclined his head. "Indeed, sir." The inspector turned to Lydia. "You discovered the body?" The maid nodded, her throat working as she swallowed. "I went to wake her, as I always do. The door was locked. I knocked, but she didn't answer. I thought perhaps she was still asleep, but after a few minutes I got worried." Miss Marple studied the girl's face. She was young, no more than 20, with a face that had likely been cheerful once, before fear and grief had taken root. "You said you always woke her?" she asked gently. "Was Miss Hastings an early riser, then?" Lydia blinked at her, as if surprised by the question. "Oh, yes, ma'am. She always liked to be up before the rest of the house. She said she enjoyed the quiet." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "A creature of habit, then?" Lydia nodded. "Yes, that's why it was strange. When she didn't answer, I went to fetch Mr. Pettigrew, and we forced the door." Her voice wavered. "She was just lying there." Miss Marple noticed her hands twisting in her lap, fingers knotting and unknotting. A girl racked with nerves, yes, but also with guilt. Mrs. Connolly spoke next, her voice brisk and no nonsense. "I saw nothing out of place last night, but I did hear voices." Inspector Forsyth straightened. "Voices? Whose?" The housekeeper pursed her lips. "Miss Hastings and someone else. A man." Gerald Fenwick's head snapped up. "A man? That's impossible." Mrs. Connolly gave him a measured look. "Nevertheless, I heard it. I was passing her door around 10:30. There was no shouting, no argument, just voices, low and urgent." Miss Marple noted the way Fenwick's hands clenched in his lap. He had been so sure, so certain that Annabel had been alone. But certainty could be a dangerous thing when built on assumptions. The inspector turned back to the butler. "Mr. Pettigrew, you were on duty until late?" "Yes, sir. I locked up at midnight." "Did you see or hear anything unusual?" The butler hesitated. "No, sir." Miss Marple's fingers stilled. That was the first outright lie. She had seen his hand tremble earlier, that unconscious movement of his thumb against his palm. He had seen something, perhaps not the crime itself, but something he wished he hadn't. She spoke softly. "And yet, Mr. Pettigrew, you are troubled." The butler's face remained carefully neutral. "I assure you, madam, I am merely saddened by the loss." "Of course," she said kindly. But you see, I find that people who have truly seen nothing are often more at ease. It is those who have seen something they cannot explain or dare not speak of who seem uneasy. A muscle twitched in his jaw. He hesitated, then exhaled. There was a figure, he admitted at last. Near the terrace, just before I locked up. I thought it was my imagination, but now... Inspector Forsyth leaned forward. Who? I couldn't say. It was dark and they were moving quickly, but it was a man. A second unknown man. Miss Marple's mind ticked over the possibilities. The locket with the stranger's portrait, the second pair of shoes beneath the bed, the voices overheard at 10:30, threads of a web not yet fully formed. Gerald Fenwick's voice was tight when he spoke. You think this intruder had something to do with Annabel's death? Miss Marple studied him, then smiled gently. I think, Mr. Fenwick, that nothing should be dismissed too quickly, especially not when so many things seem to contradict one another. His expression was unreadable, but Miss Marple saw what others missed, the way his fingers had curled ever so slightly against his knee, as if bracing for something. There were still too many pieces missing, but one thing was clear. Someone in this house was lying, and the truth was waiting just beneath the surface, ready to be revealed. Miss Marple let the silence stretch, her gentle gaze sweeping over the gathered faces. It was always in these moments, when words had run their course and people were left alone with their thoughts, that true emotions crept through. Fear, impatience, guilt, they had a way of revealing themselves in the quiet. And indeed here it was. Lydia Prentice's fingers still twisting nervously, Pettigrew's jaw set a fraction too firmly, and Gerald Fenwick sitting unnaturally rigid, as though bracing himself for a storm. I wonder, she said, her voice mild, if Miss Hastings had any concerns about money. The question was met with a brief pause. Then Fenwick shook his head. She was wealthy, he said flatly. Her inheritance from her late uncle was considerable, and she was generous. She had no debts, no financial worries. Why do you ask? Miss Marple's fingers resumed their knitting. Oh, just an idle thought. It's so often at the heart of these unfortunate affairs, you know. Money, I mean. She let the suggestion settle before turning back to Lydia. You must have been quite fond of Miss Hastings, my dear. How long had you been with her? Lydia startled at being addressed directly. 2 years, ma'am. She trusted you then. I believe so. Miss Marple smiled kindly. Then tell me, my dear, did she seem afraid? The maid's mouth opened, then closed. Her fingers twisted tighter. I don't know, ma'am. A poor lie. The girl did know something. Miss Marple gave her a moment, then turned her attention to Pettigrew. And you, Mr. Pettigrew? How long have you served at Marchwood Hall? The butler's response was crisp. 25 years, madam. Ah, and did you serve under Mr. Fenwick's father? I did. And yet you did not mention seeing a visitor arrive last night, she mused. A visitor who, by your own admission, left in such haste that you barely caught sight of him. Was it concern for discretion, I wonder, or something else? Pettigrew's face did not change, but there was a flicker in his eyes, a hesitation that confirmed he had not told them everything. You see, Miss Marple continued, it's a rather tangled thing, isn't it? Annabel Hastings was to be married in the morning, so much happiness ahead of her, and yet she wrote a letter predicting her own death. She knew something, or suspected something, and it must have been quite terrible to drive her to put it in writing. What was it, I wonder? Fenwick exhaled sharply. You're suggesting she feared for her life, that someone meant to harm her. Miss Marple's voice was calm. I suggest only that people rarely write such things without cause. Inspector Forsyth, who had been watching the exchange with keen interest, cleared his throat. We need to be practical. Let's look at motives. Money, as Miss Marple said, is often at the heart of such things. Fenwick, you stood to gain from her inheritance, did you not? Fenwick's expression darkened. I won't pretend Annabel wasn't wealthy. but I didn't need her money. I loved her." Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked, and yet she did not leave everything to you, did she? He turned sharply toward her. "What do you mean?" "Oh, just a small detail," she said lightly. "Miss Hastings may have had a great deal of affection for you, but she was also quite practical. She had, after all, been engaged before." Silence fell over the room. "You didn't, no?" she asked gently. Fenwick's mouth pressed into a hard line. "She told me she had suitors before, but nothing serious." "Ah," Miss Marple murmured. "But you see, Mr. Fenwick, there is a rather striking portrait in her locket, a gentleman with dark hair and a serious expression." Lydia made a small noise in her throat. Miss Marple turned to her, her blue eyes keen. "You knew, didn't you?" Lydia swallowed. I shouldn't say, ma'am." "But you must," Miss Marple said softly. "Because Miss Hastings is gone, and the truth is all that's left." The girl hesitated. Then, in a whisper, "His name was Henry Lovell." Fenwick's face drained of color. "Lovell? The solicitor?" Lydia nodded. "They were engaged once. Years ago. But something happened. There was a terrible falling out. He came to see her last week. I don't know what was said, but she was different after that. Restless." Miss Marple's needles stilled. "And last night, when Mrs. Conley heard voices outside her room—" Lydia's breath hitched. "Yes," Miss Marple said very gently. "It was him, wasn't it?" The room tensed. Lydia nodded, barely perceptibly. "Did you see him leave?" Again a nod. Miss Marple turned to Pettigrew. "And now we understand why you hesitated, Mr. Pettigrew. Because you saw him as well, and perhaps you let him in." The butler's jaw clenched. "It was a request, wasn't it?" Miss Marple continued. "Something Miss Hastings insisted upon. You are loyal to this household, Mr. Pettigrew, but more than that, you are loyal to the truth. You knew she wanted to see Mr. Lovell, and so you did not refuse her." The butler exhaled deeply. "She told me it was personal," he admitted. "I had no reason to doubt her." "But you saw him leave?" Miss Marple pressed. Pettigrew nodded. "Yes, and in a hurry." Miss Marple's mind moved swiftly, piecing the strands together. A former fiancé, a secret meeting, a letter predicting death. And then she thought of the second pair of shoes under the bed. A terrible suspicion settled in her chest. "Inspector," she said lightly, as if it were a passing thought, "it might be wise to check whether Mr. Henry Lovell has returned home today, if indeed he ever left Marchwood Hall at all." And at that, Gerald Fenwick stood so suddenly that his chair scraped against the floor. His face was pale, but his hands were balled into fists, and Miss Marple, with all the quiet certainty in the world, knew she had found the final missing piece. Inspector Forsyth straightened as Gerald Fenwick's chair scraped against the floor, the sharp sound slicing through the tense silence. The young man's face had drained of color, but his fists, clenched at his sides, told another story, one of barely contained fury or fear. Miss Marple observed him quietly, her hands resting lightly on her knitting. She had seen such reactions before, when the truth edged too close for comfort. Forsyth stepped forward, his voice firm. "Sit down, Mr. Fenwick." For a long moment, it seemed as though Fenwick would refuse. His breath came fast, his chest rising and falling with the weight of unspoken words. Then, as if realizing his own display, he exhaled sharply and sank back into the chair, his fingers gripping the armrests. "You think Lovell killed her?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Miss Marple tilted her head. "I think," she said mildly, "that it is always unwise to rush to conclusions, but certainly his presence here last night is curious." Forsyth nodded, his gaze sweeping over the room. "Pettigrew, you say you let Lovell in. How long was he with Miss Hastings?" The butler hesitated, his fingers twitching at his sides. "Perhaps an hour." "And when he left?" Pettigrew's throat worked. He seemed distressed, hurried. He left through the terraced doors. Forsyth's mouth pressed into a thin line. And what time was this? The butler hesitated just a fraction too long. A little before midnight, sir. Miss Marple's fingers tightened slightly on her knitting needles. Midnight. And yet, Annabel Hastings had been found locked in her room at dawn. Could a man so clearly in a hurry have lingered unseen for hours? Something did not fit. But Forsyth had seized on the timeline. Then he was the last to see her alive. A confrontation between former lovers, a quarrel turned deadly. He turned to his sergeant. "Send men to Lovell's home immediately." The sergeant nodded and departed swiftly. Gerald Fenwick let out a breath and ran a hand through his dark hair. So it was him. But Miss Marple was watching him closely. "You seem eager for that conclusion, Mr. Fenwick." His eyes snapped to hers. "Because it makes sense, doesn't it? She saw him. He left in a rush. He must have—" He cut himself off, his jaw tightening. Miss Marple's voice was gentle. "If it were so simple, dear boy, I do believe Annabel herself would not have felt the need to write such a foreboding letter." Fenwick's throat bobbed, but he said nothing. Forsyth, however, looked satisfied. He turned to Lydia. "You saw nothing else? No other visitors?" The maid shook her head quickly, eyes darting toward Miss Marple before dropping to her lap. The inspector exhaled. "Then we wait." It was not a long wait. An hour later, the sergeant returned, his expression one of barely concealed triumph. "We found him, sir." The room tensed. Forsyth straightened. "And?" The sergeant's eyes gleamed. "He ran, sir, the moment he saw us." There was a sharp intake of breath. Miss Marple remained still. Forsyth's lips pressed together in grim satisfaction. "That settles it, then." But Miss Marple's voice was soft. "Does it?" Forsyth frowned. "An innocent man doesn't run." "Sometimes they do," she murmured. "And sometimes a guilty man waits." Her words hung in the air, barely noticed as Forsyth turned back to his sergeant. "Where is he now?" "In custody." Gerald Fenwick let out a long breath, his shoulders sagging as if the weight had lifted. "Then it's over." Miss Marple only watched him. Forsyth addressed the room. "Until further evidence emerges, Henry Lovell will remain under arrest." The group began to disperse, Pettigrew retreating toward the servants' quarters, Lydia slipping from the room like a shadow. Only Fenwick lingered, staring into the fireplace, lost in thought. Miss Marple did not move. She had seen cases like this before, a clear suspect, a damning sequence of events, so neatly arranged, so perfectly timed, too perfectly. She thought of Lovell's flight, of Pettigrew's hesitation, of Lydia's nervous glances, and she thought of the shoes beneath Annabel's bed. Something was still very wrong. She looked toward Fenwick once more. His hands were relaxed now, his shoulders looser, and that, above all else, was what troubled her most. The real criminal was still here, watching, waiting. Miss Marple sat in the quiet drawing room long after the others had left, her hands still resting lightly on her knitting. The fire flickered low in the hearth, its glow casting shifting shadows along the walls. Inspector Forsyth was satisfied. Too satisfied, but Miss Marple had long learned that an answer coming too easily was often no answer at all. The past had a way of reaching into the present, and this crime felt tangled in something much older than a single night's events. She thought again of the shoes beneath Annabel's bed, a detail the police had overlooked. A second pair, too large to be hers, but placed there deliberately, almost as if someone had known they would be found. A detail meant to mislead. And then there was the name, Henry Lovell. Miss Marple had heard it before, though not in connection with Annabel Hastings. No, it was older than that. A memory, buried deep in the pages of an old newspaper she had read in St. Mary Mead years ago. A scandal, a death, a name whispered in hushed tones. Miss Marple did not believe in coincidence. She rose, her movements unhurried, and made her way toward the library. If Marchwood Hall had any record of its past, of its ghosts, it would be here. The library was dim, its heavy velvet drapes drawn against the night. Shelves of books lined the walls, old ledgers and journals neatly stacked in the cabinets. It was there, in a leather-bound volume labeled Estate Records, that she found the first thread of what she sought. Marchwood Hall had a long history, and with it, secrets. She traced her fingers over an entry nearly 30 years old. Elizabeth Marchwood, deceased. Cause, drowning, a tragic accident. Survived by her son, Gerald Marchwood Fenwick. Miss Marple stilled. Gerald Fenwick. Her eyes scanned the record again. Elizabeth Marchwood had been young when she died. And, Henry Lovell's name appeared in the adjacent notes. Not as a solicitor, but as a witness to the inquest. A witness. And now, 30 years later, Henry Lovell had returned. Miss Marple felt the pieces clicking into place. Annabel Hastings had been engaged before. To Lovell. She had broken it off for reasons unknown, but she had not severed ties completely. She had met with him again, privately, before her death. And Lovell had fled upon being confronted by the police. Too neat. She closed the ledger softly, lost in thought. Annabel had written a letter predicting her own death, but what had she truly been afraid of? Not just a jealous former lover. No, Annabel had stumbled into something else, something buried in the past. And then she knew. Miss Marple moved swiftly now, though with the same gentle grace she always carried. She stepped from the library, down the dim corridor, and toward the great hall, where a single lamp still glowed. Gerald Fenwick stood there, his back to her, staring into the fire. He did not turn when she approached, though his shoulders tensed ever so slightly. "You knew, didn't you?" she said softly. His fingers tightened around the mantel. Knew what? That Henry Lovell had a reason to return to Marchwood Hall beyond Annabel. He turned now, slowly. His face was carefully composed, but Miss Marple had spent a lifetime reading the truth in men's eyes. "I don't know what you mean," he said. Miss Marple gave him a kind smile. "Oh, but you do, dear boy, because it was never about Annabel at all, was it?" Fenwick's jaw clenched, but he said nothing. Miss Marple continued, her voice gentle. "Your mother, Elizabeth Marchwood, drowned 30 years ago. A terrible accident, or so they said. But Henry Lovell was there, wasn't he? He knew the truth of it." Fenwick's breath came sharp through his nose. "He lied," he whispered. Miss Marple nodded. "And you waited all these years to make sure he paid for it." The fire crackled in the silence. Fenwick's voice, when it came, was tight with years of restrained fury. He covered it up. "My mother, she didn't slip, she was pushed, and he let them say otherwise." Miss Marple's heart ached at the weight in his voice. "You killed Annabel," she said softly. Fenwick's fists clenched. "She found out," he admitted. "I never meant for her to, but she started asking questions about Lovell, about my mother, and you knew she wouldn't stay silent." A breath shuddered from him. "I asked her to stop. I told her it was dangerous to dig up the past, but she wouldn't listen. She was going to tell him, confront Lovell herself. And so you silenced her first." A long pause, then a nod. Miss Marple sighed. "Oh, my dear boy, you let vengeance steal more than justice ever could." Fenwick's hands trembled at his sides. "He deserved to suffer," he said, his voice hoarse. "But he didn't kill her. I did." There was no triumph in his admission, only a hollow finality. Miss Marple turned as footsteps approached. Inspector Forsyth stood in the doorway, his expression grim. He had heard everything. For Gerald Fenwick, the past had finally caught up. Miss Marple did not move as Inspector Forsyth stepped forward, the weight of Fenwick's confession settling into the room like an oppressive fog. The young man stood motionless by the fire, his fingers splayed on the mantel as though bracing himself against the inevitable. And yet, despite his admission, Miss Marple felt something was still askew. The truth was close, but not complete. Inspector Forsyth's voice was measured. "Gerald Fenwick, you are under arrest for the murder of Annabel Hastings." A muscle in Fenwick's jaw twitched, but he did not resist. His gaze, dark and unreadable, flickered toward Miss Marple. If he had expected sympathy, he found none. Only quiet contemplation. But Miss Marple, for all her years of experience in human nature, felt a single persistent tug of doubt. Fenwick's confession had come too easily. He had not denied anything, not fought against it, not tried to mislead. But there was something in his manner, an absence of relief, an unfinished sentence hanging in the air. She looked again at the firelight casting sharp shadows across his face. A man guilty of murder, truly guilty, would either show terror at being caught or bitterness at his failure. Gerald Fenwick displayed neither. She turned suddenly to Forsyth. "Might I ask a small favor, Inspector?" Forsyth gave her a wary glance. "A favor, Miss Marple?" "A demonstration," she said lightly. "I do find that certain small tests can reveal so much more than lengthy interrogations." Forsyth sighed, but knew better than to dismiss her instincts outright. "Go on, then," he muttered. Miss Marple smiled and turned to Pettigrew, the butler, who had been hovering near the doorway, his pale face lined with tension. "Pettigrew, would you be so kind as to fetch me Annabel Hastings's shoes?" The request was met with silence. Every head in the room turned to Miss Marple with varying degrees of confusion. Fenwick's brow furrowed. "Her shoes?" "Yes, dear boy," Miss Marple said kindly. "The ones found beneath her bed. I would like to examine them." Pettigrew hesitated only a fraction before nodding stiffly and disappearing from the room. Miss Marple sat down, folding her hands in her lap, waiting. Forsyth shifted impatiently, but she merely gave him a placid smile. At last, Pettigrew returned, carrying a pair of delicate evening slippers. He handed them over without a word. Miss Marple turned them over carefully in her hands. Then, quite deliberately, she looked up at Gerald Fenwick. "Are these the shoes Annabel was wearing on the night she died?" Fenwick blinked, caught off guard. I don't know. Perhaps." Miss Marple tutted gently. "Oh, but I think you do." A flicker of something passed across his face. Unease, or perhaps realization. Miss Marple lifted the shoe slightly. "There is something most curious about them. You see, these shoes are clean. Too clean." Pettigrew inhaled sharply. Forsyth frowned. Miss Marple continued, her voice mild but unwavering. "Annabel was locked inside her room, yes? The door bolted from the inside, and yet these shoes bear no dust from the floor, no marks of movement. That suggests they were never worn inside that room at all." Forsyth's frown deepened. "You're saying—" Miss Marple nodded. "I'm saying that Annabel did not die in her room at all. She was moved there afterward." A hush fell over the room. Fenwick, for the first time, looked stricken. "But he faltered. His throat worked as though struggling for words. Miss Marple tilted her head. "Yes, dear boy." His lips parted, then closed. A tremor passed through him. I didn't move her." The room seemed to shrink around them. Miss Marple gave a soft sigh. "No, Gerald, I don't believe you did." The confession had been too easy, because it had not been real. She turned to Pettigrew, who had gone very still. His hands were clasped behind his back, but she noted the tension in his knuckles, the way his breathing had subtly shifted. "You," she said gently, "moved the body." Pettigrew flinched, but kept his composure. I beg your pardon, madam." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, studying him. Annabel Hastings was not killed in her room. She was moved there after the fact. Someone staged the scene to make it appear as though she had died alone. Pettigrew's jaw tightened. That is a serious accusation. Miss Marple sighed. I do not believe you killed her, Pettigrew, but you were involved. His face remained rigid, but a flicker of emotion passed through his eyes. Miss Marple pressed on, her voice gentle. Who are you protecting? A breath hitched in his throat. His gaze darted to Fenwick, but not with guilt. Rather with something closer to sorrow. Miss Marple saw it then. The truth finally slipping through the cracks. She turned to Inspector Forsyth. The real murderer has not yet been accused. Forsyth exhaled sharply. Then who? Miss Marple's gaze shifted past Pettigrew, toward the doorway. Lydia, the maid, stood there, pale as death. Her fingers clutched the edge of the door frame, her wide eyes fixed on the shoes in Miss Marple's hands. Miss Marple's voice was barely above a whisper. Lydia? The girl's lips trembled. A single tear slid down her cheek, and then her knees buckled. Lydia crumpled to the floor with a soft cry, her hands pressed against her chest, as though trying to hold her heart together. Miss Marple moved quickly, her age forgotten as she knelt beside the young maid. Forsyth, still in shock, had not yet processed the significance of the girl's sudden collapse. Miss Marple, what is this? Forsyth began, but the detective silenced him with a simple gesture. Lydia's sobs echoed in the otherwise silent room. She didn't speak at first, but after a few moments she gathered herself, wiping her eyes with the sleeve of her dress. I didn't mean to, she whispered, her voice thin with fear. Miss Marple gave her a comforting look. You didn't mean to do what, my dear? I didn't mean to hurt her, Lydia said, her voice breaking. But she was going to ruin everything. I didn't know what else to do. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, but she kept her voice steady. Who, Lydia? Who was going to ruin everything? Lydia hesitated, glancing at Fenwick, who stood frozen, his face now ashen. It was Henry Lovell, she whispered at last. A shift rippled through the room like a sudden breeze passing through still air. Henry Lovell, whom everyone had assumed was merely a witness, a man of the past, was now at the center of everything. Miss Marple rose, moving to the window to let the cool night air settle around her. She needed time to think. This new revelation only deepened the mystery. Why had Lydia been protecting him, and what role had Lovell played in this twisted series of events? The answer seemed to be just beyond reach, but something was slipping, something important. Where is the evidence? Forsyth's voice broke the silence, sharp and demanding. Lydia's eyes darted nervously toward the door. It's gone. The letters, the notes, they were in my drawer. I swear, Inspector, they were there last night, but now they're gone. Gone? Forsyth's voice rose in disbelief. Miss Marple's mind was already racing, connecting the dots. It was all starting to fit together, but someone was determined to keep the pieces scattered. Someone had known the case was progressing too far, too quickly, and had acted before Miss Marple could close in. The letters, Miss Marple murmured, turning to face Forsyth. Lydia, tell me, how did you come to have them? Lydia hesitated, her eyes shifting between Miss Marple and Forsyth. I found them in Henry's office. It wasn't meant to be like this. I just wanted to help him. He said they were important, that they'd explain everything, that they could prove he wasn't to blame. But when Annabel found them, when she saw what they said, she threatened to tell. Miss Marple's heart tightened. Annabel found out the truth, didn't she? She found the proof of Henry Lovell's involvement in your mother's death. Lydia nodded, her face pale. She was going to go to the police. She told me she'd be back the next day to confront him. I couldn't let her do that. Where are the letters now? Forsyth demanded again, his frustration mounting. They're gone, Lydia repeated, the words hanging in the air like a final sentence. I don't know who took them, but they were gone this morning when I went to check. The drawer was empty. A cold realization crept up Miss Marple's spine. Someone knew you would be looking for them, Lydia. Someone who wanted to keep those letters from the investigation. She turned toward Forsyth. The evidence has been tampered with, and whoever is responsible doesn't want us to uncover the truth. The inspector's jaw clenched. But why now? Why steal them at this moment? If Fenwick had already confessed— No, Miss Marple interjected, her voice sharp with understanding. Gerald Fenwick's confession wasn't the truth. It was a distraction. The real criminal wanted us to believe we had everything solved. They wanted to bury the true motive before we could unravel it. And now they've gone to desperate lengths to keep us from uncovering it. Who? Forsyth asked, though his tone was already tinged with suspicion. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on Lydia for a moment before turning toward Fenwick. He had not moved, still standing in place, eyes cast down as though processing a different kind of defeat. I don't know yet, she said quietly. But someone in this house is still playing games, and they're not done. The house, which had once seemed a quiet, peaceful place, now felt heavy with secrets. It was as though the walls themselves were watching, waiting. Miss Marple knew that this was not over, not by a long shot. But the theft of the evidence had changed everything. Whoever was behind this was calculating and clever. Someone who was deeply embedded in the household, with enough knowledge to stay hidden in plain sight. Lydia, Miss Marple said suddenly, her eyes narrowing. Where was the last place you saw Henry Lovell? Lydia recoiled at the mention of his name. He was in his study last night, but he left. Left without a word. I didn't see him after that. Miss Marple exchanged a glance with Forsyth. Henry Lovell had gone missing, and now crucial evidence had disappeared with him. The investigation had taken a darker turn. They're not finished, are they? Forsyth muttered. No, Miss Marple replied, her voice steady. Whoever did this is still playing a long game, and now we must watch every move. The tension in the room was palpable, thickening with the sense that something was about to break. Something important. Whoever had stolen the letters, whoever had been working behind the scenes, had made one fatal mistake. They had underestimated Miss Marple's persistence, and they would soon learn just how dangerous a thing it was to underestimate her. The evening air was crisp as it filtered through the open windows of the drawing room, the silence broken only by the occasional creak of the old house settling. Miss Marple sat in her chair, the firelight flickering over her thoughtful face as she reviewed everything she had learned. The stolen letters, the secrets tangled in Lydia's confession, the shadowy figure of Henry Lovell. There were too many loose threads, but they were all leading her in one direction. Her musings were interrupted by the sound of hurried footsteps outside the door. Pettigrew, his face drained of color, appeared in the doorway, a nervous tremor in his voice. Miss Marple. Inspector Forsyth, there's been an incident. Forsyth looked up, his gaze sharp. What is it? Mr. Lovell. Pettigrew's voice broke as he spoke. He's gone. Vanished. Miss Marple stood instantly, her gaze narrowing. Gone? How? The servants found his study door open, and there's no sign of him. No one has seen him since last night. His things, his clothes, his briefcase are all gone. But— Pettigrew hesitated, wringing his hands. The most troubling thing, Miss Marple. There's blood. The room went still. Forsyth's eyes met Miss Marple's, and in that instant, both understood the gravity of what had just happened. Where? Forsyth demanded. Upstairs in the study, Pettigrew replied. The blood, it leads toward the back door, but there's no sign of struggle. It's as though— His voice faltered, as though he just disappeared. Miss Marple's mind clicked into overdrive. Prepare the others, Inspector. We must examine the study immediately. Forsyth nodded and turned, already barking orders to his men. Miss Marple moved swiftly behind him, her every step focused. Lydia, still shaken by her earlier collapse, had been escorted to a quieter part of the house, but Miss Marple knew that whatever had happened in that study would reveal more than the blood trail alone. The study was eerily quiet when they arrived, the bloodstains stark against the polished wooden floor. There was no sign of a struggle, no overturned furniture, no broken glass. Yet the blood was real, too fresh to have dried completely. It trailed from the desk to the door, as Pettigrew had said, but there was no sign of the man himself. Forsyth knelt to inspect the stains. It doesn't make sense. Why would there be blood but no body? Why isn't there a fight? Miss Marple stepped carefully around the room, her eyes taking in every detail. The blood was meant to lead us to one conclusion, to the idea that Mr. Lovell was injured, possibly even killed. Her gaze flickered to the desk, where a few papers were scattered in disarray, seemingly untouched by the chaos. But I believe Mr. Lovell is still alive. The inspector's head snapped up, his eyes wide with disbelief. Alive? But how can you be so sure? She gestured to the papers, her fingers brushing lightly over the corners of a few sheets. Notice how they are arranged. The papers on this side of the desk are undisturbed, placed as they should be. Whoever staged this scene wanted to create the illusion of violence, to make us believe Lovell had been attacked, but they overlooked the simplest detail. If Lovell had been truly injured or killed, there would be a greater disorder. Forsyth's gaze shifted from the bloodstains to the desk, then back to Miss Marple. His expression was a mixture of confusion and dawning comprehension. Lovell staged this, Miss Marple continued, her voice steady. But why? Before Forsyth could reply, the sound of a sharp cry rang out from downstairs, followed by the hurried shuffling of feet. Pettigrew appeared in the doorway, his face stricken. "Miss Marple, it's Lydia," he gasped, struggling to catch his breath. "She's gone, disappeared." The words hit like a blow. For a moment, Miss Marple couldn't speak. She had been so certain, so sure that everything was connecting in a logical way, but now the ground seemed to shift beneath her. She turned swiftly toward Forsyth, her voice calm but insistent. "Lydia must know something, something that could explain what has just happened. We need to find her, now." Forsyth was already moving, his urgency matching hers. How could she just disappear? Wasn't she in a safe place? "Someone must have known we were getting closer," Miss Marple said, her thoughts racing. "Someone has been moving the pieces on the board before we could reach the end, and now Lydia has been taken. Or worse." They hurried to the hallway, where the rest of the servants and officers had gathered, whispering anxiously. A sense of dread hung thick in the air. Lydia's disappearance was a stark reminder that the villain behind all of this was still in control, pulling strings from the shadows. But the blood, Lovell's blood, was a crucial piece of the puzzle. Someone had intentionally made it seem as though he had been hurt, possibly fatally. But why go to such lengths to deceive them? Miss Marple's mind spun, trying to connect the new events with everything she had learned. It wasn't just about Annabelle anymore, or even Henry Lovell. The stakes had changed. Someone who knew every inch of this house, every secret, was playing a far more dangerous game. The silence was broken again, this time by the sound of someone running toward them. Sir, Forsyth's officers returned from the back of the house, their faces pale. "Inspector, Miss Marple," one of them stammered, his eyes wide with shock. "There's something outside by the garden. It looks like a body." Miss Marple's heart skipped a beat. "Another body?" "Yes, ma'am," the officer said. It's a woman." Without another word, Miss Marple and Forsyth moved as one, hurrying out the back door, their footsteps quickening with each passing moment. The garden, normally tranquil and serene, felt foreign, shadowed by the weight of everything that had happened. And in the center, near the hedge, lay a figure, crumpled and unmoving. As they reached the body, Forsyth bent down to confirm what Miss Marple already suspected. The woman was wearing a familiar dark dress. It was Lydia. Miss Marple's breath caught in her throat. The girl was unconscious, but still alive. Barely. A thin, dark line of blood streaked across her temple, but it was the strange angle of her body, the way she had collapsed near the hedge, that was most unsettling. "She's been drugged," Miss Marple muttered, crouching beside her. "But there's something else here. Someone's trying to make sure we never get the whole story." She glanced up at Forsyth. "We need to find Henry Lovell. Now." The twist had taken them deeper into a web of lies and betrayal than either of them had anticipated, and with every moment that passed, the villain's grip on the truth tightened. The house felt colder now, as if the walls themselves were closing in on the investigation. Forsyth's officers had quickly carried Lydia back inside, her condition still grave. But she was breathing, her pulse faint but steady. The doctor had arrived and was working to stabilize her, though the look in his eyes suggested that he wasn't as hopeful as he would have liked to be. Miss Marple stood at the window, watching the rain that had begun to fall outside. The faint patter against the glass seemed to underscore the disquiet in the air, a quiet that matched her own thoughts. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to form, but there was something still just out of reach. Something that had evaded her grasp, like a whisper in the dark. She turned, her eyes settling on the scattered papers on the table. It had been a long night, and the investigation had only grown more tangled. Lydia's disappearance and the mysterious blood stains had upended their earlier assumptions. Yet as she looked at the papers in front of her, Miss Marple felt a small flicker of something stir in her mind. It was a feeling she'd often had in the past, one she knew well, a sense that something had been overlooked, something crucial. Her eyes fell on the report from the servants. It was a simple document detailing the activities of the household, but something about it caught her attention. It wasn't the blood or the body outside. It wasn't the questions they had asked Lydia or the mysterious note they had found in her room. It was something far smaller, something that had been dismissed by everyone else in the chaos of the night. A misplaced cup, a cup that had been left on the table in the kitchen, far from where it should have been. It wasn't an unusual object, just an ordinary porcelain cup, slightly chipped, with a faint floral pattern that had long since begun to fade. It had been reported as nothing more than an inconsequential detail, a momentary lapse in someone's habit of tidying up. But now, in the stillness of the moment, Miss Marple realized that it was more than that. She remembered something from the earlier days of the investigation. There had been a conversation, a passing remark by one of the servants that had seemed insignificant at the time. The housekeeper had mentioned, almost offhandedly, how Mr. Lovell had always been particular about his routine. "He never leaves his cup out of place," she had said. "Always puts it back where it belongs." It was a trivial thing, yes, but it was also the key. For the cup wasn't just misplaced, it had been deliberately left out of place. Someone had known that Lovell's obsession with order would make him notice it, and that would lead him to a false conclusion. Miss Marple's thoughts shifted, turning rapidly as her mind raced. Who else knew about Mr. Lovell's peculiarities? Who else was close enough to have understood his habits, to anticipate his next move? She remembered the conversation with Lydia earlier in the evening. Lydia had been distraught, her words stumbling over each other, but there had been a subtle hint in her speech, something Miss Marple had nearly missed. Lydia had said, almost in passing, "It's just like he always said. Everything has a place." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. Everything has a place. That was it, wasn't it? The obsession with order, the routine that Lovell had kept so carefully. The pattern had been hidden in plain sight. Miss Marple turned quickly, her mind now racing to catch up with her conclusions. She could feel the pieces falling into place like the clicking of a lock. She hurried to the door, calling out to Forsyth as she did. The inspector, his face worn from hours of fruitless searching, turned at her voice. "Miss Marple?" Forsyth asked, his brow furrowing. "We've been looking at this all wrong," she said, her voice steady but urgent. "The key to this case isn't just in the blood or the missing person. It's in the patterns, the habits that we've overlooked." Forsyth's eyes narrowed. "You think the cup?" "Yes," Miss Marple interrupted, her gaze sharp. "Someone knew exactly how Mr. Lovell would react to a small disruption. The cup wasn't just left there by accident. It was meant to throw him off track, to lead him down the wrong path." She paused for a moment, allowing the significance of her words to sink in. "But it's more than that. The person who did this, who orchestrated this chaos, knows Lovell. They know his routines, his obsessions. They use that knowledge to create confusion." "But why?" Forsyth pressed. "What does it get them?" Miss Marple's lips thinned as she thought, piecing together the rest. "This is about control. Whoever is behind this isn't just trying to kill someone. They're manipulating everything. They want to control the investigation, to make sure we follow the wrong leads, to make us think Lovell is the victim when in fact he's the one pulling the strings." Forsyth was quiet for a moment, considering her words. Then he nodded, the gravity of the situation settling over him like a cloud. "So you think Lovell is still alive?" Miss Marple didn't answer right away. "I'm certain he's still alive. But someone has been trying to keep us from realizing that. They want us to focus on Lydia, on the blood, on the disappearance, anything to keep us from seeing the truth." Forsyth clenched his jaw, the realization hitting him. "And now we've got to find out who that person is, before they make their next move." Miss Marple's eyes were cold with resolve. "Exactly. Whoever is orchestrating this has already shown their hand. It's time to uncover the final piece of the puzzle and stop them before they do any more damage." The investigation had reached a turning point. The pattern that had seemed so elusive was now clear. Everything had been in plain sight all along, hidden in the smallest of details. Miss Marple knew they were close, but the real danger was only just beginning. Whoever was behind this would stop at nothing to keep their secrets buried, and Miss Marple had no intention of letting that happen. With a final glance at the rain-lashed windows, Miss Marple turned back to the room, her mind already racing ahead. The house was quiet now, the bustle of the investigation having slowed as everyone waited for Miss Marple's next move. She sat in the library, her mind sifting through the various threads of the case, trying to make sense of the new revelations. Each clue seemed to pull her in different directions, yet there was one truth that had remained constant. Nothing was what it seemed. She glanced over at Forsyth, who had been standing by the window, lost in his own thoughts. The storm had passed, but the unease still lingered in the air like the scent of rain on the earth. It was clear now that whoever was behind this had been careful, deliberate in every move. The blood in the study, the misplaced cup, Lydia's disappearance, and even the seemingly random act of poisoning. It was all connected, but the question remained. Why? Forsyth turned toward her, his brow furrowed. "Miss Marple, I don't understand. We've followed every lead, every trail, but nothing makes sense. There's something missing, something that ties it all together, but I can't put my finger on it." Miss Marple leaned forward, her fingers gently tracing the edge of the desk. "There is something, Inspector, but it's not what you think." He raised an eyebrow, curiosity piqued. "What do you mean?" "The motive," Miss Marple said softly. "You've been looking for a simple answer. Money, power, revenge. But the truth is more complex than that. The true motive is far deeper and far more unsettling." Forsyth looked at her, his expression turning serious. "You're saying it's not just about greed or anger?" "No," she replied, her voice calm but firm. This is not a crime motivated by conventional desires. It's something darker. Miss Marple stood and began to pace the room slowly, her eyes distant as she considered the pieces once more. The letters, the blood, the carefully orchestrated deception. There had to be a connection, a single thread that would reveal the true driving force behind it all. It was then that she remembered something Lydia had said earlier. Her words, though disjointed and frantic, had struck Miss Marple as odd at the time. Lydia had been confused, but she had also been frightened, not just for herself, but for someone else. She had kept mentioning he in her delirium. "He won't stop until it's done," Lydia had whispered. "He's been planning it for years, since the beginning, but I didn't know. Miss Marple stopped pacing and turned toward Forsyth, her face illuminated by a sudden understanding. "It's not just about money. It's about something much more personal, something that goes back to the very core of this family." Forsyth's expression hardened. "What are you suggesting?" "Think about it," Miss Marple said, her voice steady. "Henry Lovell, his obsession with control, his patterns, his manipulation of everyone around him, his family, his employees, he's been pulling strings for years. But what if the real reason for all this chaos isn't power or revenge? What if it's something far more twisted?" She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. Forsyth waited, his eyes narrowing as the pieces began to click into place. "The truth is, Henry Lovell is not the victim. He's the architect," Miss Marple continued. "This entire situation, the blood, the disappearance, the manipulation of Lydia, it was all part of his plan. But why? What could drive a man to such lengths?" Forsyth's face was grim as he pieced it together. "You're saying he planned everything, but why would he hurt his own family, his own wife?" Miss Marple nodded slowly, her eyes flickering to the fireplace where the embers still glowed faintly. "Lydia was never meant to be a victim. She was a pawn, a means to an end. The real target was Annabelle." Forsyth stiffened. "Annabelle? But she's been nothing but a bystander in all of this. What could she have done to deserve—" "It's not what she's done, Inspector. It's what she represents." Miss Marple's voice softened, almost sorrowful. Annabelle was the key to Henry's grand scheme. She had something he needed, something he thought he could control. The detective turned away, as if lost in thought, and Miss Marple's mind raced ahead, tying the final knot in the web. She had it now, the psychology behind the crime, the twisted motivation that had been obscured by the more obvious signs of violence. Henry Lovell was not just seeking control over his family, Miss Marple said, her voice barely above a whisper. He was seeking redemption. Forsyth blinked, confusion evident in his expression. Redemption? But for what? For something far more insidious than any of us could have guessed, Miss Marple replied, her voice tinged with sorrow. Henry Lovell wasn't always the man he appeared to be. He had secrets, deep, dark secrets. Secrets that he tried to bury, to suppress, to control. But they never went away. They festered, and in the end, they drove him to this. Miss Marple's mind turned back to the family's history, the whispers that had reached her ears about Lovell's past. She had never been one to pry, but now it all made sense. The cracks in his veneer, the way he controlled every detail of his life, it was all because of one thing, guilt. And that guilt had eaten away at him for years, creating a psychological landscape where only one thing could ease his torment: control. Henry Lovell wasn't just obsessed with controlling his family, his fortune, or his reputation, Miss Marple said, her voice steady. He was obsessed with controlling the legacy of his past, the sins he had committed, the people he had wronged, especially Annabelle. She was his greatest regret. The room grew quiet as Forsyth absorbed her words. He finally spoke, his voice low, filled with a mix of disbelief and horror. "You mean He hurt Annabel to get to the truth? To punish himself? Miss Marple's gaze darkened. Not just to punish himself. He believed that if he could control her, manipulate her, then he could absolve himself of the guilt he carried. He wanted to erase the past, to rewrite his history. But in doing so, he became a prisoner of his own making. His need for control became his undoing. Forsyth's hand clenched into a fist, his expression hardening. So it wasn't just the money or the power, it was his guilt, his need for redemption. He went to all these extremes just to forgive himself. Miss Marple nodded, her expression somber. And now, everything he's done, every life he's ruined, has led us to this moment. It's not just a crime, it's a tragedy. A man so consumed by his own past that he was willing to destroy everything around him in a futile attempt to save himself. Forsyth's eyes locked with hers, and for the first time, the detective understood the full depth of the case. It wasn't about the blood or the violence. It was about the unraveling of a man's soul. And now the truth had come to light. But at what cost? The storm outside had long passed, but the oppressive atmosphere in the Lovell estate remained. The night was heavy, as if the very walls were holding their breath, waiting for the inevitable. Miss Marple had seen the signs. She had known all along that the final moment would come, when Henry Lovell, cornered by his own lies and guilt, would have no choice but to face the consequences of his actions. Forsyth, ever the skeptic, had voiced his doubts. "You're sure he'll come for it?" he had asked earlier in the evening, standing in the dimly lit drawing room where the last remnants of the investigation had unfolded. His hands were still trembling from the revelations, but his sharp eyes never left Miss Marple's face. She had nodded slowly, the lines of her face unmoving. He will, because he can't help himself. And now, as they waited, she was certain. The pieces were in place. The trap had been set. Miss Marple had arranged it all so carefully. Forsyth and his men had taken their places around the house, each aware of their roles but unaware of the true depth of what was about to unfold. Annabel was safe in her room, out of sight, and no one would expect what would happen next. No one, except Henry Lovell. She heard a faint sound, the creak of a floorboard beneath the weight of a heavy footstep. Then, a shadow passed across the doorframe, momentarily darkening the corridor. Miss Marple's pulse quickened, but her composure remained unshaken. This was the moment she had been waiting for. The moment when Henry Lovell, the man who had orchestrated it all, would step into the final act of his own tragedy. She glanced at Forsyth, who had taken up a position by the staircase. His hand rested on the holstered revolver at his side, though he knew it was not violence that would resolve this. It was psychology, observation, and the relentless pressure of truth. The door to the library creaked open, and Henry Lovell stepped inside, his posture rigid, his eyes darting around the room, calculating. His expression was one of calm, but it was the calm of a man who knew he was out of time. His lips tightened as he saw Miss Marple seated at the center of the room, her hands folded in her lap, waiting. Forsyth's eyes never left him. "I knew you would be here," Miss Marple said softly, her voice cutting through the silence like a knife. "I was certain you would come. You couldn't resist." Henry's eyes flashed briefly, a flicker of panic behind his well-practiced mask, but he regained control almost immediately. "I don't know what you mean," he said, his voice steady but forced. "You have no proof, Marple." "No evidence." Miss Marple didn't respond immediately, letting the silence stretch for a few beats. She watched him, noting the way his fingers twitched ever so slightly at his side, the way his breath quickened, small, almost imperceptible signs of the tension mounting inside him. "You're wrong, Henry," she said finally, her words slow and deliberate. "I have all the proof I need." He took a step back, as if the air had suddenly become too thick to breathe. "Proof? What proof? You have nothing." You think I don't know?" she continued, her voice now gaining strength. "You think I haven't figured out the reason behind all of this? Why you went to such extremes? Why you hurt the people you supposedly loved?" His jaw tightened, but he did not speak. Miss Marple could see the anger building inside him, the fury that he had kept buried for so long. He was unraveling, and it was no longer possible for him to hide it. "You wanted to erase your past," Miss Marple went on, her eyes locked on his. "You wanted to bury your sins, your guilt, and you thought that if you controlled Annabelle, manipulated her into believing that you were in charge, that you could somehow redeem yourself. But the past doesn't go away, Henry. You can't control it." Henry's eyes widened for a moment, then narrowed again, calculating his next move. He turned to Forsyth. "You've been playing her, haven't you? Letting her manipulate you into thinking you had a chance at catching me. But you were too late." A chill ran through the room as he reached for the gun at his belt, pulling it out with swift precision. Miss Marple didn't flinch. Neither did Forsyth. The tension in the room was thick, like a storm on the horizon, ready to break. Henry raised the weapon, but before he could point it in their direction, Forsyth lunged forward, knocking it from his hands in a blur of motion. The sound of the gun clattering to the floor echoed like a drum beat, a final punctuation to the chaos that had been building for months. "Do you really think you can escape now?" Miss Marple asked, her voice calm, unwavering. "It's over, Henry. You've lost." He stumbled backward, his eyes wild, as if seeking some way out. But the reality of his situation had caught up with him. There was no more running, no more lying. The trap had closed around him, and he was caught, exposed. "Why did you do it?" Forsyth demanded, his voice low but filled with an intensity that matched the danger of the moment. "What made you think you could get away with it?" Henry's face twisted in frustration, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "I didn't have a choice. She was the one thing I couldn't control. I had to fix it, fix her, before it destroyed everything." The confession hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Miss Marple watched him closely, seeing the desperation in his eyes. It wasn't just guilt. It was a man who had spent so long trying to outrun his own sins that he had convinced himself he could bury them forever. "You were never going to fix anything, Henry," Miss Marple said softly. "And now, all your efforts, all your schemes, they've led you here. To this moment when you have nothing left." The tension in the room was palpable as the full weight of his failure sank in. Henry Lovell, the master manipulator, the man who had been pulling strings for years, was now nothing more than a broken man standing in the ruins of his own making. Forsyth moved forward, taking Henry's arms and securing him in handcuffs. The sound of the cuffs clicking shut was the final note in the symphony of his downfall. As the detective stepped back, she allowed herself a moment to reflect. The case had been a tangled web of lies, deceit, and betrayal, but in the end, it had been the simplest truth that had unraveled it all. A man's need for control, his guilt, and his own tragic inability to forgive himself. For a moment, Miss Marple thought about Lydia, about Annabelle, and about the toll this investigation had taken on all of them. But there was no time for mourning. The game was over. The pieces had fallen into place, and the villain had been caught. The storm had passed. But in its wake, the truth had finally emerged. The case, it seemed, had come to a close. The handcuffs clicked shut around Henry Lovell's wrists, and Forsyth's men took him into custody, their expressions a mix of exhaustion and triumph. Miss Marple sat back in her chair, watching the scene unfold before her. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to relax, to breathe. The threads had been pulled together. The labyrinth of lies, the twisted motives, all had been unraveled. But there was something gnawing at her, a feeling she couldn't shake, like the faintest whisper in the back of her mind. She had seen this before, the sense of finality that was often followed by another, deeper layer of truth. The worst cases, the ones that would haunt a detective for years, rarely ever truly ended. She had learned not to trust appearances, not in her line of work. The room was quiet, save for the murmur of voices as Forsyth and his team finalized the paperwork. The storm outside had passed, leaving behind a heavy silence that felt too oppressive for comfort. The atmosphere had shifted. A strange tension lingered, just out of reach, like a shadow that didn't belong. Miss Marple's eyes drifted toward the desk where Henry's personal belongings had been placed. Papers, a few personal effects, and, curiously, a sealed envelope. It had been there the entire time, unnoticed, tucked beneath a pile of documents. She hadn't seen it earlier when the investigation had first started to unfold. Now, it seemed to call to her, its presence somehow. Deliberate. She didn't know why she hadn't noticed it before. Perhaps it had been too well hidden. Or perhaps she had been too focused on the more obvious clues. Either way, something about that envelope felt important. She picked it up, turning it over in her hands. It was addressed to Forsyth, his name scrawled across the front in hurried, almost frantic writing. The seal was broken, but the envelope itself looked untouched, pristine. "Forsyth," she called softly, her voice breaking through the quiet murmur of the room. "Could you come here for a moment?" Forsyth glanced up from his papers, his expression weary but curious. "What is it, Miss Marple?" She held up the envelope. "This was here when we arrived. Did you see it?" He took a step forward, his eyes scanning the document. "I didn't. No. I've never seen it before." "That's odd," Miss Marple mused, turning the envelope over in her hands again. "It's addressed to you, after all." Forsyth frowned, a tinge of unease creeping into his voice. "I don't know why it would be here, or who would leave it. But if it's for me, we should see what it says." He carefully opened the envelope and pulled out the letter. As he read, Miss Marple could see his expression shift, his brow furrowing deeper with each line. The air between them thickened, as if the words on the page were hanging in the balance, waiting for something, waiting for him to speak. "Well?" Miss Marple asked, her voice steady but edged with anticipation. "What does it say?" Forsyth slowly lowered the letter, his gaze meeting hers. For the first time, she saw a flicker of confusion, followed by something else. Doubt. It was subtle, but it was there. "It's from Henry," Forsyth said, his voice low. "But it doesn't make sense." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. "Doesn't make sense? What do you mean?" He handed her the letter, his fingers trembling ever so slightly. Miss Marple took it and read. "Forsyth, by the time you read this, it will be too late. You have caught the wrong person, and you will regret this mistake more than you can know. The real criminal is someone much closer to you than you think. You have always been blind to the truth, but now it's time to open your eyes. The last move was never mine to make." Miss Marple felt a chill pass through her as she finished reading. She looked at Forsyth, who stood stiffly, his face pale. "What is this?" she murmured, more to herself than to him. "Henry," Forsyth repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "He's claiming I've been deceived." Miss Marple's mind raced. This wasn't just a letter of accusation. It was a challenge. A last-ditch effort to muddy the waters and pull Forsyth back into the web of lies. She knew the kind of manipulation it took to sow that kind of doubt, especially in someone who had already been as close to the truth as Forsyth had. But the letter also contained a deeper implication, something far more troubling. Henry Lovell had been sure, so sure, that the investigation had gotten it wrong. But why? Why, at this final moment, would he send Forsyth a letter like this? What was it he was trying to say? "It's a game," Miss Marple said suddenly, her voice sharp as the realization hit her like a wave. "A final trick. Henry isn't trying to escape. He's trying to make you question everything you've done." Forsyth's eyes flickered with a mix of frustration and confusion. But why? He's already in custody. That's what makes this so dangerous, Miss Marple explained, her voice cool but urgent. He knew, just like we did, that his days of freedom were over. But he also knew the power of doubt, of making someone, anyone, question the truth. And right now, it's you he's targeting. For a moment, Forsyth was silent, his thoughts churning. He glanced at the letter again, his mind clearly processing the implications. "I don't understand," he muttered. "Why would he think I wouldn't figure it out? Why go to such lengths to lie about something so obvious?" Miss Marple leaned back in her chair, her eyes narrowing. "Because, Inspector, the final twist hasn't come from him. It's come from someone else, someone who's been watching all of us. The real mastermind isn't Henry Lovell. It's someone who's been pulling the strings from the very beginning." Forsyth's jaw tightened as his eyes shifted to meet hers, the realization sinking in slowly, almost imperceptibly. "You mean someone you know?" Miss Marple said softly, her voice steady. "Someone close to you? Someone who has been playing all of us for a fool? Someone who has been in plain sight the entire time?" The room seemed to grow colder as Forsyth's mind began to connect the dots. The final piece had shifted into place, and suddenly everything that had seemed so solid now felt fragile. The case, so neatly wrapped up just moments ago, was once again wide open, a vast, unknowable expanse. The game, it seemed, was far from over. And in that moment, Miss Marple knew that the true test of her genius had yet to come. Miss Marple remained seated, her hands folded neatly in her lap, watching Forsyth with an intensity that made the air between them seem charged. The truth was not yet clear in his eyes, but the pieces were there, waiting to fall into place. She could see the wheels turning behind his gaze, the careful sifting of thoughts as he tried to reconcile the final revelation with everything they had uncovered. The room was quiet except for the soft rustling of paper and the distant sound of rain tapping against the windows. Forsyth stood still, lost in his thoughts, until at last he spoke, his voice strained. "I don't understand. Who could it possibly be? Who's been behind all of this?" His hands trembled as he placed the letter back onto the desk, the weight of it pressing on him like an unseen force. Miss Marple let out a small sigh, an almost imperceptible shift in her posture that spoke volumes. The time had come to pull back the final veil of the mystery, to reveal everything she had been quietly observing from the beginning. She had known from the first moment that Henry Lovell, while a key piece in the puzzle, wasn't the true mastermind. No, it had always been someone else, someone who had known Forsyth, someone who understood how to manipulate him. "Do you remember," she began slowly, "the photograph of Mrs. Lovell that was found at the crime scene? The one in Henry's pocket? It seemed so simple at first, didn't it? But I knew it had to mean something more. You see, the photo wasn't just a memento. It was a symbol of something far more insidious." Forsyth's brow furrowed, the memory coming back to him. "I remember, but it didn't make sense at the time. It was just a picture, a way for him to hold on to something from the past." "That's what you thought," Miss Marple continued, her voice calm but cutting through the confusion. "But it wasn't a memory for Henry. No, it was a message. A message for someone else." She paused, allowing the tension to build, her eyes never leaving his. "For you, Forsyth." For a moment, Forsyth stared at her, stunned. "Me?" he repeated, as though the words themselves didn't make sense. "But what do you mean?" Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her gaze steady. "Henry was trying to make sure you would understand. The picture wasn't of Mrs. Lovell. It was a picture of someone else entirely, someone you knew, someone who was always just behind the scenes, never in the foreground. The true villain was never Henry. It was always your own deputy, Victor Gray." Forsyth's face went white as the revelation hit him. "Gray?" he breathed, almost in disbelief. "But how could—" "Let me explain." Miss Marple interjected, her voice firm and unshakable. Gray had been working with Henry from the very beginning, but his role was subtle. It wasn't about the money or the power. It was about control. He knew you, Forsyth, knew your weaknesses, your trust. Gray had positioned himself perfectly, weaving in and out of the investigation without raising suspicion. He manipulated the case so that you would focus on Henry, keeping you distracted. All the while, he played the long game. Forsyth's face was a mask of shock and anger. But why? Why go through all this trouble? What was his goal? Miss Marple's eyes gleamed with understanding. Gray wanted to destroy you, Forsyth. It was never about the crime itself. It was about your downfall. He knew that you were growing too comfortable, too confident. As a detective, you were starting to see too clearly, perhaps too many things that others missed. He needed to take you down before you became a real threat. He used the case, your investigation, to expose your vulnerabilities, and in doing so, he destroyed your ability to trust anyone. Forsyth stood frozen, the weight of the realization pressing on him like a crushing force. The loyalty he had once felt for his deputy, the trust he had placed in him, now felt like a distant memory, an illusion shattered by a single, painful truth. But how did he pull it off? How did he make sure the evidence pointed away from him? Forsyth's voice trembled, the depth of his betrayal clear in every word. Miss Marple's eyes softened, but there was no pity in her gaze, only the steady calm of someone who had seen this before. Gray knew exactly what you would look for, and so he crafted the evidence to lead you in the wrong direction. He was careful, methodical. He planted the seeds of doubt where you would never think to look. Take the missing files from the office. You assumed they had been tampered with by Henry or someone else, but it was Gray who had taken them, using them to cover his own tracks. And the envelope you found, the one that led us to think Henry had written it, was Gray's final move. He knew that it would provoke doubt in you, shake your resolve just enough for him to slip away unnoticed. A wave of realization swept over Forsyth, the pieces finally clicking together in his mind. So it was all a diversion. A game, and I was the pawn, he whispered, a deep bitterness creeping into his voice. Miss Marple nodded slowly, her expression unwavering. Precisely. But Gray underestimated one thing, you. He thought that by controlling the narrative, he could steer you away from the truth. He didn't count on you noticing the small, telling details, the inconsistencies in the story, the way the suspects reacted under pressure. He never anticipated that you would find your way back to him, piece by piece. But now, Forsyth's voice faltered. Where is he now? What happens now? Miss Marple shook her head, her face clouded with resignation. The game has changed. The moment you started to see the truth, Gray knew his time was up. He was too clever to let it go this far. I'm afraid the letter was just his way of giving himself one final edge, a final chance to escape. By the time we reach him, he will be long gone. Forsyth closed his eyes, his hands clenched tightly at his sides. So it's over, he muttered. Not just for the case, but for me, for everything I've worked for. Miss Marple rose from her chair, her steps slow and deliberate. Justice has its way of catching up, Inspector. Sometimes it doesn't come as we expect, but in the end, it always does. Forsyth's gaze lifted to meet hers. There was a flicker of understanding, but also a deep ache, the sting of loss and betrayal settling in his chest. For you, Forsyth, she added softly, her voice gentle yet firm, justice hasn't escaped. It's simply waiting. Sometimes the most satisfying victories are those that come not in the courtroom, but in the quiet moments after the storm has passed. As she turned to leave, Miss Marple couldn't help but feel a small measure of satisfaction. Justice, in its own way, had been served. But it would be a long time before Forsyth truly understood the full cost of his trust. And as for Victor Gray, well, There was a place for men like him in the shadows. But even shadows could not hide forever. Miss Marple walked out of the office, her steps quiet on the polished floors, her thoughts as composed as ever. The investigation was over, or so it seemed. Forsyth, though shaken by the betrayal of his trusted deputy, would recover in time. The public would hear of the case soon enough, and justice, though delayed, had still been served. But as Miss Marple stepped into the cool evening air, a lingering feeling settled in her chest, a nagging sense that something was amiss, something small that had slipped by unnoticed, even in the face of victory. The case was wrapped up, and yet she couldn't quite shake the thought that this puzzle, so carefully constructed, might have one last piece hidden just beyond reach. Her eyes scanned the sky as she walked through the quiet streets. The wind had picked up, rustling the leaves of the trees, carrying with it the sharp scent of rain that had yet to fall. It was a peaceful evening, but there was an edge to it, an almost imperceptible shift in the air that made her pause. As she walked, her mind returned to the letter, the one that had started everything, the one that had pointed them down the wrong path. Forsyth had been so eager to believe that it was the key to unlocking the mystery, and for a time it had seemed so. But now that everything had been revealed, she couldn't help but wonder, who had written it? It had been a simple thing, a letter penned in haste, its contents direct and damning. And yet, as much as it had served its purpose, Miss Marple couldn't dismiss the odd way it had been delivered, the precision with which it had been placed in the evidence room. It was almost as though someone had expected it to be found at exactly the right moment. Her fingers brushed the edge of her shawl as she contemplated this, her sharp eyes scanning the surroundings. She had been so focused on the immediate case, the visible players, that she'd allowed herself to overlook the deeper patterns, the ones that hinted at something more. The cold breeze bit at her skin as she turned onto a quieter street where the shadows seemed a little longer, the night a little deeper. A small pub sat at the corner, its dim light spilling out onto the cobblestones, and for a moment Miss Marple was tempted to step inside, warm herself with a cup of tea, and rest her weary mind. But then it struck her. There was still that small detail. The photograph. It wasn't the one that had been found with Henry Lovell, nor the one that had given them the first clue. No, this was the one Forsyth had mentioned, the one he had claimed to have seen in Victor Gray's office the night they arrested him. A photograph that had been carelessly left on the desk, perhaps as an afterthought. At the time, she hadn't paid it much mind. Gray had been too careful to leave anything overtly incriminating. But now, in the quiet of the evening, Miss Marple realized that this photograph might hold the key to understanding the full extent of Gray's manipulation, perhaps even to understanding who had truly been pulling the strings all along. She walked faster now, the soft tap of her shoes quickening as she made her way back toward the station, toward the one person who could shed light on this last piece of the puzzle. The photograph had been overlooked, yes, but perhaps there was something hidden within it, something no one had noticed before. By the time she arrived at the station, the sky had darkened further, and the air felt charged, as though the world was holding its breath. Miss Marple knew that once she found the photograph, the final pieces of the mystery would be laid bare. But when she stepped inside, her eyes met Forsyth's, who had been pacing behind the desk. He looked up, startled, but there was something else in his expression, something unreadable. "Miss Marple," he greeted her, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. "I thought you had left for the night." "I couldn't," she replied quietly, her gaze already flicking toward the desk. "There's one last thing we need to look at." Forsyth furrowed his brow but followed her gaze. "The photograph?" "Yes," she said softly. "Do you still have it?" He hesitated, as if he were trying to decide whether to indulge her curiosity or not. Finally, with a resigned sigh, he reached into a drawer and pulled out a small envelope, which he handed to her wordlessly. She opened it slowly, her fingers brushing over the edges of the photo inside. As she lifted it, her breath caught in her throat. It was a picture of Victor Gray. But this time, he wasn't alone. In the background of the image, just barely visible, stood another figure, partially obscured by shadows. It was someone Miss Marple had never expected to see, someone she had barely considered in the whirlwind of suspects. The figure in the photograph was none other than Mary Forsyth, the inspector's own wife. Forsyth's face drained of color as he stepped closer, his eyes fixed on the photograph. "What is this?" he whispered, his voice trembling. Miss Marple turned the photo over in her hands, inspecting it carefully. There was nothing written on the back, no identifying marks, just a sense of something hidden between the lines. "It seems," she said quietly, her mind already racing through the implications, "that there is still one more layer to this mystery, one that connects all the dots in ways you and I never could have anticipated." Forsyth swallowed hard, the weight of the discovery pressing down on him. "You mean my wife?" Miss Marple nodded slowly. "It appears that Gray's manipulation didn't end with you, Forsyth. Mary was involved too, and I believe she has been a silent partner in all of this. She knew more about Gray's plans than anyone realized." Forsyth stood frozen, his face a mask of disbelief. "But why? Why would she—" "That," Miss Marple said gently, "is a question I'm afraid we'll have to answer together. But one thing is clear, the case isn't finished, not by a long shot." As she turned to leave, the sound of the rain finally started to fall, soft and steady against the windows. And in that moment, Miss Marple knew. This mystery, like all the others before it, would never truly end. There would always be something more to uncover, some hidden truth waiting just out of reach. And with that thought, she stepped out into the night, her mind already working, already planning her next move. Because in her world, mysteries never truly stopped. They simply waited for the right moment to reveal their final secrets.